Did you know that during the pandemic, Americans were tipping more generously than before? And perhaps you did it too. Part of it was due to human compassion during the difficult times. Well, it all led to tipflation. But then with rising inflation, Americans started to feel their wallets getting tighter. And now consumers have reached the tipping point of tipping. In fact, this phenomena is now being called tip fatigue. This in turn is leading some restaurants and businesses to impose automatic tips on their bills. Today we're looking at tip fatigue and what it indicates, where the U.S. economy is heading. We'll also look at the controversy surrounding the federal minimum wage and whether California will kill McDonald's if it were to raise the minimum wage in the fast food industry to $22. All this to say, you get a better idea of car affordability after you consider these life circumstances. Americans love eating out. That's why during the pandemic, when Americans were mostly stuck indoors, we all shared one thing in common. We started loving our deliveries more than ever before, be it through Amazon, which by the way doubled profits during the pandemic, but most especially food deliveries like Uber Eats and DoorDash. Just look at the stats. A study by the Columbia Business School found that the pandemic was responsible for 85% growth in the food delivery business. Actually, this phenomenon wasn't isolated to just the U.S. It was global, especially in Anglo-American countries like the UK, Canada, and Australia. And businesses were quick to jump on the train. They quickly adapted demand, and because of COVID protocols, the number of contactless payment methods spiked. Well, this was a new convenience. It's causing Americans to spend more because the touchscreen systems typically solicit consumers for suggested tips ranging from 15% to 25%. Now, during the pandemic, Americans were fine with that. They showed generally more compassion and appreciation in light of their circumstances, and they tipped more than ever before. But fast forward to today. We're out of the woods. In many ways, we're back to normal daily grind of things. The difference is now there are more contactless payment systems than ever before, but also we have higher inflation than ever before the pandemic. People are already feeling the pinch of inflation. So now, when businesses prompt consumers for tips, consumers are less motivated to be generous. Americans are plain tired of it, and that's why there's a new term called tip fatigue. You see it in the numbers. Due to inflation, 17% are tipping less than before, and 54% don't like being pressured to tip. This is why some restaurants are pretty much forcing customers to tip. Basically, they just add an automatic 20% gratuity to a customer's bill. For starters, that can be pretty deceptive. At minimum, if a restaurant practices this, they should at least put a clear sign so consumers know about it. I was almost fooled in a restaurant when there was a 20% tip, and then they have under that suggested tips, but I didn't put any because it already had 20% on. Now, of course, this isn't always the case. And even if a restaurant posts a sign, automatic tipping in general isn't a common practice here in the States. So it's putting many customers off. Some even feel it's unethical. It's supposed to be a tip for good service. The thing is, we Americans have a history and culture of freedom and choice. We like the option to choose how much to tip as we wish. No one likes being forced to do it. In my opinion, it's better for these restaurants to just raise the prices on their menu, so as long as it gives you the option to choose your tip. The thing is, in the U.S., workers in the service industry rely on tips. That's because the minimum wage is pretty much not a livable wage. Here are 3 sad facts. First, the U.S. federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. So if you're working full-time at minimum wage, that means you're making $1,160 each month. That wouldn't even cover your basic needs like rent, food in most cities, so it's clearly not a livable earning. Secondly, the federal minimum wage hasn't changed since 2009, despite the normal inflation we typically see each year. And I'm not even accounting for the unusually high inflation we've been seeing in recent times. But if you think that's bad, we're not done yet. Here's the worst part of it. The federal minimum wage remained unchanged despite inflation, means that the value of the hourly wage has actually decreased over time. In other words, those earning minimum wage, in effect, have less purchasing power. If you were to adjust this value to account for inflation, well, we can see that the purchasing power of the federal minimum wage effectively decreased by 26%. Right now, there are at least 1.25 million Americans who earn at or below the federal minimum wage. That's just over 1% of the American population. Actually, back in January 2022, Biden raised the minimum wage for federal employees and contractors to $15. But here's the thing. That minimum wage doesn't apply to people outside of the federal sector. President Biden stated that one day all workers here in the U.S. will enjoy a federal minimum wage of $15. Despite his wishful thinking, efforts for that have stalled. We're talking about some 30 to 32 million Americans who earn less than $15 an hour right now. So if Congress were to raise the federal minimum wage, we're talking almost 10% of the U.S. population would benefit. But here's the thing. While that would definitely help some 30 plus million Americans for sure, the reality is that once that happens, corporations will start charging consumers more for their products. After all, they'll need to make up for the money they lose to pay their workers. Eventually, prices for products and services will go up, which will create its own ripple effect, and ultimately feed even all the way into the rental market. So at the end of the day, raising the minimum wage, while good, isn't an absolute cure-all for solving the problems of livable wages. But when it comes to wages, we need to look at the state level. U.S. states have the power to set a minimum wage in their own state boundaries as long as it meets the federal minimum wage level. Right now, 30 states have a state minimum wage that's higher than the federal minimum wage rate, and that's a good thing. But 5 states, all of which happen to be in the South, don't have a state minimum wage. I'm talking about Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Tennessee. 2 states, Georgia and Wyoming, have a state minimum wage that's actually lower than the federal standard, which to me doesn't make any sense. So in these 7 states, the federal minimum wage of $7.25 applies, since all states are required to meet the minimum federal level. As of January 2023, only 3 states have a minimum wage that's above $15. This includes Washington State at $15.74 an hour, California at $15.50, and Massachusetts at $15 an hour. In June 2023, Connecticut will join that list when it increases the state minimum wage to $15. It's good progress that these states are moving forward like that. Other states are set to join in the years to come. And actually, this is starting to remove the spotlight from New York City. 4 years ago, New York City set its minimum wage to $15. It was progressive at its time, a leader in fact, but now it's lagging behind. And mind you, New York City is literally the most expensive city to live in the entire U.S. And logic tells you that theoretically it should have the highest minimum wage in the U.S., but that's not the case today. Some 10 years ago, New York was at the forefront of a campaign called Fight for 15. This campaign began back in 2012. It started when workers walked out of dozens of food service joints in the city. The workers demanded a minimum wage of $15 an hour and to be allowed to form a union. And actually, they gained the backing of powerful labor unions. I'm talking about New York Hotel and Gaming Trades Council and also the Service Employees International Union. With their support, the Fight for 15 campaign was able to spur a proposal to raise the minimum hourly wage for the majority of workers in New York City, and they achieved it. In fact, the minimum wage increased from $9 to $15 an hour over 3 years. But in recent times, many cities like LA, Washington, D.C., and Denver have increased their minimum wages accordingly. For example, the minimum wage in Washington, D.C. is $16.10 an hour. But for some reason, New York City hasn't budged despite inflation. In the last 4 years that have passed since New York last raised its minimum wage, the buying power of the $15 has dropped by around 15%. In fact, some analysts say that New York City workers have been set back 4 years to the time their minimum wage was $13 an hour. Others say that if New York doesn't act soon to raise the city's minimum wage, it will fall further behind as living costs will only continue to rise. Rent is skyrocketing. Wages are not. Today, due mainly to the higher inflation we've seen in 40 years, some believe New York needs to raise its minimum wage to at least $20 an hour. But let's shift attention to California. Recently, the California State Senate passed a bill. It gives a 10-person council the authority to raise the minimum wage to $22 an hour for fast food chains with more than 100 locations nationally. The council also has the authority to establish safety conditions. Of course, California fast food workers are major fans of the new bill. Supporters say that the bill will empower fast food workers and help solve wage theft and unsafe working conditions. But the Californian restaurant industry is afraid how this bill will affect restaurants. And they're also afraid of the example it might set to other states. With this bill, a McDonald's franchisee with 2 locations would be subject to this bill. But an owner of 25 restaurants that's not part of a chain would be exempt. McDonald's rarely ever speaks out publicly against state legislation, but the chain made an exception for this California bill. Get this, almost 10% of U.S. McDonald's restaurants are located in California. Now technically, McDonald's only operates about 5% of its 13,000 plus U.S. locations. Its franchisees operate 95% of them, but that didn't stop McDonald's from lobbying on behalf of its franchisees. McDonald's is far from the only fast food chain in California that's opposing this bill. Restaurants like Chick-fil-A, Chipotle Mexican Grill, Yum Brands, and Restaurant Brands International are just a few of the big names who spent big bucks to lobby California lawmakers to oppose this legislation. An industry group called the National Restaurant Association even spent $140,000 to fight the bill. Within the 3 months since the bill was passed, some 45% of California restaurant operators reported that business conditions were worse. California Governor Gavin Newsom hasn't indicated if he'll sign or veto the bill, so we'll have to wait and see if California will kill McDonald's or not. But look, with where the minimum wage is right now, coupled with inflation, it's hard enough for many Americans to afford basic needs like rent and food. Forget about getting an electric car. In fact, forget about getting any new car for that matter. When you're in those life circumstances, having a car is a luxury and a liability, and public transportation, carpooling, ride sharing, or biking are your main options. But now you tell me, what's the minimum wage in your state? What do you think the federal minimum wage should increase to? Please share by commenting below. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for your support.